Hello, everyone. Thank you very, very much for being here with us today. We are Women Talk Back, and we are the Feminist Student Society at the University of Bristol. Um, we are delighted to have you here tonight. As some of you know, we organized Feminist Academics Talk Back so that we could host the event at the Victoria Rooms, which have this long history of the suffrage movement. But unfortunately, the coronavirus hit and we decided to postpone the event. So now we're delighted to host it online because that means that a lot more people, a lot more women can come and join us now. So thank you everyone for being here with us today. We are commemorating the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which is of course November 25th. So our Feminist Talk Back event is part of the 16 days of action to end violence against women that the Feminist Student Society, Women Talk Back, is organizing. So Feminist Academics Talk Back invites both our University of Bristol community and members of the public to listen and to engage with feminist academics and researchers, scholars, as they address the advances that women have made in academia and also the things that still need to be worked on and the challenges that women face within academia. This issue is particularly important in the age of the Thoughtless mob, where censorship and the silencing of critical opinions and dissent is spreading across universities, both in the UK and worldwide. So we are delighted to also understand that this is a very bleak subject, but we are keen to host the event as part of the 16 days to end violence against women because we are aware of how too many academic institutions have historically and continue to condone the bullying, the harassment, and the abuse of female staff and students inside of the university campuses. We're hosting 5 different feminist speakers from the UK and Australia. We have Dr. Megan Tyler, we have Dr. Emma Hilton, Dr. Heather Bromscott-Evans, Dr. Michelle Moore, and Dr. Kathleen Stock. So we're going to introduce every one of them when it is their time to speak. But before we begin, I just wanted to say a couple of words about Women Talk Back. And Women Talk Back is the Feminist Student Society at the University of Bristol. There are others, but we're like the real one. And we provide a bi-weekly space for women to engage in lively discussion and debate. We are open to all women. It doesn't matter whether they are students or not. It doesn't matter their income or their social background. We are in pursuit of the global... Sorry, can you hear me? Okay. We are in pursuit of the global liberation of women from all forms of patriarchy. We center women, therefore we center women who experience misogyny, but also women who may experience racism, anti-lesbianism, classism, and other forms of structural discrimination that arise from male domination. We are committed to the power of sisterhood, and we believe that it is only through an understanding of our similarities and differences that we can liberate ourselves from patriarchy. We believe that dialogue between women is the first step towards liberation from oppressive structures and practices. We welcome women from all backgrounds to join and to take part in all aspects of the group. We aim to foster a culture of collective responsibility, care, and honesty with ourselves and with each other. So the format of our event is going to be we're going to introduce the speakers, and we're going to be listening to all of them for about 10 to 15 minutes, a little bit over, it doesn't matter. And then we're going to just have a couple of questions for them. We don't have a lot of time for questions, but we'll try.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about what it's like in UK universities at the moment when you want to talk or write about women and girls specifically. So I want to say a bit about what it's like, my impressions anecdotally, and then a bit about some of the causes of the current situation as I see them. So I think the position is somewhat mixed. If you want to talk about women or girls in an academic setting, then there are still contexts where with a bit of luck you can get away with it as long as a particular thing does not happen. And that particular thing is that someone, a student, a colleague, a journal editor or a referee doesn't interject to say, but trans women are women too, or do you mean assigned female at birth, or don't you mean cis women, or something similar. In other words, you can talk about women and girls as long as nobody mentions gender identity or trans people. And at that point, convention dictates that you must immediately stop talking about female people and start talking about gender identity, which of course means that you will have changed the subject. At that point, unless you're prepared to take professional consequences, you're basically stuffed and will be forced to retreat to talking about something that isn't women or girls anymore, but it's either a wider category, including trans women and non-binary males, or a narrower one, not including trans men and non-binary females, depending on the case. So how likely is it that someone will ask you that sort of question? The situation again varies, and I can think of two relevant factors. Partly it varies by university subject area. In the biological sciences, although Emma might tell us differently, but I think in the biological sciences and medicine, on the whole, you're less likely to meet this sort of challenge, probably because biologists and medics are confronted relatively frequently with undeniable causal effects of being female, and so they find it hard to deny them, although obviously some still try. But on the other hand, if you're in the social sciences, I think it's more likely you'll meet this challenge. And in the arts and humanities, it's most likely of all. There is another factor relevant to whether you're likely to be confronted about why you're not talking about gender identity. And it also varies by, you're never going to guess what, sex. Yes, in the ultimate irony, it's female people that get challenged most when they're talking about women and girls. Men who make academic claims about men and boys don't get similarly challenged. So, for instance, when University of Kent academic Matthew Goodwin writes and talks about the specific challenges facing white working class boys, nobody says to him, don't you mean cis boys, or trans men are men too? And meanwhile, since academic men rarely make any claims about women and girls specifically, but tend to talk instead about people as a homogenous group, whether or not they actually mean men, then the problem doesn't arise as often for them anyway. Now, all of this has dire consequences for feminism in academia, because of course, feminist academics supposedly have a central part of their remit, discussion of the interests of women and girls. It's here then that the spectre of gender identity, as an automatic extinguisher of any discussion of females specifically, is most prevalent. Effectively, the feminist heart has been ripped out of a lot of work taking place in gender studies and women's studies departments, for work here can no longer be aimed at only females or even most females. It has to take into account trans women and the genderqueer, including males who identify as women or who don't identify as men. This means that work ostensibly on female-specific challenges is often presented confusingly by falsely pretending that genderqueer males also face those same challenges. Equally, as it's hard to pretend with a straight face that genderqueer males face challenges around menstruation, pregnancy, maternity, and menopause, these topics are less often explored these days. Now, I have a slide, which I will attempt to show you. Okay, so this is just anecdotal, but I did a search today between these 5 feminist journals taken pretty much at random, except that I know that they're quite well known. And I looked for search terms between 2015 and 2020 of the word queer, pregnancy, maternity, menstruation, and menopause. And as you can see, and I looked for that search term anywhere, not just in titles, but as you can see, queer wins. I was very surprised at how infrequently menstruation and menopause are ever talked about, apparently, in feminist journals these days. And I must also say that when I looked for pregnancy and maternity, I didn't exclude queer pregnancy, queer maternity, which is quite a hot topic, but I think that gives you some kind of indication of what I'm talking about. So partly due to the fear of ever being seen to say something about females generally, what work that is done on females is just often described as being about cis women, which of course excludes females who are trans men or non-binary. And even when research is done on so-called cis women, it's most often done on certain groups designated as particularly oppressed, Black or Latina or disabled cis women, and so on. Compositional diversity or complexity amongst these groups, for instance, in terms of differences in background, social class, and economic security, political allegiances, religious faith, and so on, is often ignored in favour of what seems to me to be cherry-picking, caricature, sentimentalisation, and infantilisation, in some cases, even at its best, where academic claims are based on close, patient ethnographic work. The topic in feminist journals tends to be, say, women in northwestern Ghana, rather than women from Stoke-on-Trent. Now, obviously, I'm saying it should be both. Equally, the lives and challenges faced by white women are also homogenised and dismissed, often. White women, whether working class or middle class, rich or poor, raped, assaulted, prostituted, exploited, underpaid, objectified or otherwise, are often dismissed as privileged and so unworthy of serious sympathetic study. Via such means, I would go so far as to say that much of academic feminism carried out in English-speaking countries has become irrelevant to ordinary women and girls in those countries. There is a sustained failure to discuss mainstream women and girls' experiences as indicated by the dearth of mention of such mundane, near-universal experiences as menstruation and menopause in academic feminist journals, as you just saw. There are still some good articles in feminist journals, but there's also I'm just going to be honest and say, like I see it, a lot of dross that is beyond parodic and could only possibly be of interest to other academics equally invested for career-based reasons in the language games involved. Take the example from the most recent edition of Australian Feminist Studies, Queer Ecologies of Death in the Lab, Rethinking Waste, Decomposition and Death Through a Queer Feminist Lens, in which the author describes queer ecologies of death in the lab as a material discursive phenomenon focusing on the fruit fly, discussing how fruit flies can be understood in various binaries and how heteronormative and humanistic ideologies about purity shape the space of the laboratory and regulate waste management practices. Now, my aim is not at all to blame the author of this article for writing it. They are only doing exactly what the system encourages them to do, but in terms of a discipline of practical relevance to the majority of women and girls, this system looks broken. Perhaps needless to say, the consequences of this are bad for women and girls, both within universities and beyond it. Within universities, there's a lack of a strong voice defending the distinctive interests of women students and staff, as well as defending women and girls as distinctive research subjects. Indeed, it's even worse than this. Gender studies professors, naively assumed by others in the university to be the official arbiters of what is important for women, blithely assure anyone who will listen that females as a sex have no distinct interests of their own and may not even exist as a category, talking instead of vaginal privilege and or genital fetishism. Apart from the loss of female-centered knowledge, another result is that there's no real pushback on university policies on spaces and resources for women, entirely allocated by self-identification. Whether it's a changing room, a student residence, a sports team, a women's officer role, or an activist meeting on the so-called gender pay gap, which we all know is actually the sex pay gap, self-identifying women are the group encouraged to attend, not females, not women, and social ostracism from self-identified feminists follows for anyone daring to question this. Even worse, beyond academia, graduates shaped by their studies at universities carry their female blind visions out into the world. Here's Heather. Utterly convinced of their rectitude and go off to propagate them in the third sector generally, including women's organisations and equality organisations in particular. This has resulted in well-established organisations like the Feminist Society and the Women's Equality Party being split and effectively neutered when it came to properly representing women's interests in the gender recognition row. It's piecemeal funded grassroots organisations like Women's Place, Fair Play for Women, Transgender Trend that fought this battle for ordinary women and not the feminist third sector. So I think it's a bleak picture. And I'm sorry if this is a bit depressing, but how has this happened in universities? And I think, again, my impressions anecdotally, there are a range of contributory factors, far more than I could ever hope to cover, but here are a few that I think are relevant. And all of the following comes with the usual caveat that I'm talking about trends, and there are always honourable exceptions to any trend. So the first trend, I think, is the tendency of some in the applied humanities and social sciences to take certain fashionable philosophical theories at face value and then run with them, irrespective of whether the theories actually stand up to scrutiny. In my own discipline, philosophy, there is still, thank God, encouragement to treat every new theory you encounter with an attitude of grumpy suspicion. You have to test it for structural weaknesses, improbable consequences, inconsistencies, and other problems before you endorse it. Negative criticism is far more common than positive endorsement. To take a pertinent example, I know very few people in my side of professional philosophy who treat Judith Butler as a serious intellectual figure. That is, her totalizing, simplistic version of social construction is thought of as naive and simplistic as a metaphysical view. But in other areas, like gender studies and some parts of English, art history, sociology, and so on, Butler's views and those of others in the same vein are treated as basically right and then applied to some particular interest or issue, queering the fruit fly in the laboratory, queering Hildegard of Bingen or whoever. In data science, they say rubbish in, rubbish out, but you could just as easily say that if you put in a junk philosophical view like Butler's into a discussion of something else, you will get out exactly what you put in. A byproduct of academics treating theories like Butler's as starting points of inquiry rather than as end points is that those who do so are quite literally unable to defend their starting points intellectually. If you ask them why we should accept there's no material reality outside linguistic construction, or what they mean by material reality, they have nothing to say. This means they tend to resort to defensive dogmatism and aggressive insults when questioned by philosophers like me. They start to treat their preferred theoretician as a quasi-religious figure whose pronouncements cannot be questioned, and perhaps in order to escape tricky questions about their own theoretical starting points, they try to position themselves as heroic activists achieving social justice by writing impenetrable prose in academic journals, despite the fact their articles are read by an average of about 6 people and possibly understood by fewer. Over time, this makes some academics operate more like cult leaders than intellectuals, where a cult is defined as an authoritarian organisation centred around a belief that has rules and dogma and encourages its members to isolate themselves from those who would test their faith. Moving on, another factor here is the professionalisation of academia, where it's now mandated that you will churn out research articles and books on a regular basis in order to gain employment or promotion. The huge pressures on feminist academics to publish, and not just to publish, but to come up with something new, means that eventually every position in logical space will be argued for, whether or not it should be argued for. New academics quickly learn the basic rules of the academic feminist language game, and then they run with it, taking it further and further into unintelligible technical language and irrelevancy to most women's lives. A third factor of relevance here, whether academics want to recognise it or not, in virtue of their professional positions, most of them, including me, obviously, belong to an elite, and so end up talking about things only of interest to that elite in a language only that fellow members of the elite can understand. Hence, for instance, the large number, here I'm getting even more controversial, but the large number of articles in feminist philosophy about implicit bias and microaggressions, and sometimes even about implicit bias and microaggressions in academic philosophy, a subject of no real interest to anyone who is not an academic philosopher. Academics also tend to be insulated from the consequences of their expansive political posturing. It's incredibly striking to me that those feminist academics who would campaign for self-ID in prisons, shelters, and hostels stand pretty much no chance of ever finding themselves in those situations, and yet would happily give away the rights of women in those places who so often have histories of poverty and abuse. A fourth factor, and I've got 2 more to go, a fourth factor in UK academic feminism's increasing irrelevance is the Americanization of feminism following the Americanization of UK academia generally. With some honourable exceptions, as always, academic feminists often tend to be obsessed with social issues and movements that started in the US and which are not straightforwardly applicable to the UK without a lot of scrutiny of the evidence and how it works. Yet they ignore more local and pressing issues for UK women, such as domestic violence, femicide, the vaginal mesh scandal, sex game gone wrong defences, the women's state pension scandal, high rates of mental health problems amongst young women, low rape conviction rates, grooming gangs, the problem of honour-based abuse, and so on. Again, it is often left to grassroots feminist activist groups to fight these battles, which they do brilliantly. A fifth and final factor, I think, it's not the end of the story, but it's the end of my talk, is that academics generally will hire, publish, positively referee, mentor, and give grants to others who are politically like themselves, who emulate their own approaches. And this is, I think, why within universities, it's often relative outsiders to professional academic feminism, people like the people on the panel tonight, and people like Selina Todd and Alice Sullivan and an increasing number of others, including students who are not seeking to publish in feminist journals, we didn't make our original careers in those networks. We are able to vocally critique gender identity or ideology, where apparently so many within women's studies and gender studies apparently cannot. So, and if any of you are listening, please join us. Okay, that's it.
So that was just so interesting listening to Kathleen. Thank you for that. I'm going to kind of extend the conversation a bit by carrying on with this alarming proposition that female critical thinkers in universities can't say what they might want to say. I'm particularly picking up the idea that we are being targeted by colleagues and students using the tactics of the mob, which was described in the outline for this session. Now, that's an extraordinary claim, bleak and disillusioning indeed, that there should be mob tactics in use against targeted female academics in a university near you. And that makes my mind spin, but it actually is indeed the case in my experience. And I thought tonight that I might think about that a little bit more, reflect on that, mainly for the purposes of consolidating courage and resistance. In the days running up to the March event, I had a horrible experience of being told by my dean about the mob targeting of me by a group of colleagues who were petitioning to undermine my work and my job. And this wasn't actually my first encounter with the tactics of petitioning mobs. I had, with the help of hundreds of people that I'd had to ask to support me, including many who are probably here tonight, managed a few years ago to withstand an international campaign to depose my editorship of a world-leading journal. And I'd managed to do that, but when I heard about another mob coming after me, it wasn't my experience that repeated exposure to these brutal campaigns toughens one up. And these attacks and acts of aggression don't become easier to withstand for me. I find that each attack is actually re-traumatizing. And I was so re-traumatized in March that I had thought that even if we made it to the podiums in Bristol at the wonderful suffragette place, I might actually find myself literally unable to speak, because it's so paralyzing by them was the impact of the return of the mob. And I share this glimpse of fragility because while it's imperative that we don't allow those who are orchestrating and taking part in these attacks to reify the impacts of their campaigns, I think it really is important that the extent of harms to women in the firing line are recognised. These mob tactics do constitute bullying. They are violent, they are harmful. And as academics, I feel that we ought to be operating in a context where our institutions and trade unions protect us from harm. And I know that sometimes that happens, but in my experience and in the experience of too many others that we're hearing about, there is actually an ongoing failure to protect gender-critical female academics from sustained targeted harassment. And in my case, there are failures of protection both by human resources departments and trade unions. And this is something that I'd really like to be addressed further. I'm finding that there's such fear of the tactics of the mob when it comes to the work of critical female academics, that your dean, your senior administrator, vice chancellors, trade union allies, they become so afraid that someone will catch them not applauding the aggressors that they actually allow policy and practice to be overtaken and hijacked and sabotaged by the voices and the tactics of the aggressors. And I think that we really need to set our minds to finding ways to resist this. Women academics have the right to be free from harmful and discriminatory harassment that's driven by ideological difference. It is important, and particularly for younger female academics than I, who actually have their careers ahead of them to build. So for several years now, I've faced these campaigns of harassment, particularly harassment by complaint, crushing demands to silence me, protests, all that kind of thing, threats of violence, such as that I ought to be thrown under a bus, and even at one point, threats where people were saying they knew which bus my children got to school. And I experienced it as ironic that my aggressors claim that they have to utilize these tactics of mob violence because there's a level of violence that they say is embedded in my own work which merits this treatment. It is appalling to be publicly harassed and to be maligned in this way, but whatever the cost, I want again to reassert that I'm trying really hard not to trade my silence for survival. And so I hope that by speaking in this way about what's actually happening, that others might be able to find some confidence for speaking themselves. My case actually does affirm the suspicion that we all have that the harassment I am exposed to is sex-based harassment. There's a male comparator in my own university who offers me incredible support, who publishes similarly critical perspectives, but nobody says a word to him and he's not harassed and nobody's hounding him out. And there, I think, is a serious issue here of ongoing sex-based discrimination being tolerated and allowed to cause significant harm to female academics, and we need to draw attention to that. So I think lots of people know that a campaign of public shaming rolls on and on around me, and my transgression is that I'm calling for evidence on the safety of gender intervention for children and young people, and for public debate on why children and young people are being told they can change sex when I think Emma will probably confirm they can't. And this question doesn't, as I'm often accused, stemmed from a violent political and ideological desire of mine to deny the existence and treatment of children and young people identifying as transgender. It's a child-led question. It's a question asked of me by a young transitioning teenager who, after years of self-harm and trying to transition, broke down in sobs saying, why? Why did anyone tell me I could be a boy when I can't? Now, these seem to me to be critical questions for psychology and education professors such as myself, but it seems that there's a basic incompatibility claimed between my work calling for a careful discussion about these things and the position of complainants who adopt a no debate policy, saying my questions are violent and exclusionary and have no place in the university. So the harassment campaigns against me and other critical female academics actually reflect an assumption I'm finding that the universities already have, knowingly or inadvertently, adopted a no debate policy. But it's incredible to imagine that a university could formally adopt a position endorsing no debate, because such a position would entail prohibiting academic freedom. But when it comes to the work of critical female academics, the normal academic rules of engagement for which support robust debate and so on, I'm finding are just disapplied. While academics, of course, are entitled to advocate and make a case for no debate, I do think it's unreasonable for our colleagues and our institutions to act as if a no debate policy has already been adopted and to feel that they can use with impunity the tactics associated with a no debate position to target us, such as using slurs and demonization and unfounded allegations to undermine your work, and for some of us, violent acts or physical violence. Now, my critics tend to say they're compelled to use mob tactics because of the violence which underpins my research, which they say is harmful to transgender people in their everyday lives. But in all of my work, I stress my commitment to the rights of transgender people. Lots of transgender people work with me and support my work and do everything I can to bring their voices into print and to raise their perspectives and all that kind of thing. But when in the books, one of the books I've written with Heather Brunskill-Evans, we ask, how is it that our work advocating gentle, evidence-based approaches to the bodies and minds of children could provoke such intense attacks to silence and discredit us? We're shouted down, and that question in itself is said to be a transphobic question that doesn't merit an answer. So they say that I'm violently harming trans people every day by speaking, and they retaliate that they must push me under a bus and burn my books. But I'm not, as my critics push out through their willful representations of my work, transphobic or anti-trans. I know some children and young people feel that they are the wrong sex because of ideas that they have about gender, and that they suffer terribly from dysphoria and experience that suffering deeply. But I do argue that the idea of unquestioning affirmation of a child's view that they're trans and must be subject to experimental gender intervention with no debate is so superficial as a response to the suffering of children as to beggar belief. It's completely unbelievable. And I think that what's happening in a university that will shut down work advocating gentle, evidence-based approaches and questions to the safeguarding of children's bodies and minds is something that we really have to question. What credit can a university take for allowing a culture of sustained harassment, of bullying, of unsafe work environments, discrimination and victimization of female academics to shut this sort of work that we're doing down? The false accusations of ontological and violence that are said to be embedded in my work are being used to frighten and silence me. And it does create a chilling effect for other people who want to stand against the mob for fear that they'll be labelled as transphobic or violent themselves. But here what we're seeing is that violence and mob tactics in the academy are being mobilised as a form of control over critical female academics. You too will be labelled illiberal and violent, and will lose your funding and your reputation and your job if these ideologues have their way. I think this kind of culture is not what we expect in fair and reasonable academic life. I'm seeing the teaching of early career critical female academics being replaced with admin, so that they're silenced and they can't share their critical research. I'm seeing those women excluded from research opportunities. In my own experience, women excluded from research opportunities because they would not sign the petition to get me stood down. The complainants do this, they say, because they have to prevent ontological violence, which they claim is embedded in my work, from spreading further. But where is this alleged violence in my own work? I do not use the tactics of the mob in return. I don't retaliate by mimicking their tactics and marching about corridors, intimidating young colleagues into signing petitions to discredit the work of people that I disagree with. We're not operating ourselves as gender or as any kind of critical female academics as self-appointed petitioners of righteousness. We're seeking careful academic evidence-based dialogue without suppression of other people's voices and without silencing. But I'm meeting in my work an authoritarianism that really knows no bounds. My transgression is that I am going to keep the conversation open about the necessity for this conversation. That's all. I'm not anti-trans. I want trans people to be safe. I want trans people to do well, but I want there to be a really careful conversation about what's going on with the gender transitioning of children and young people, and making sure that that's safe. But what I'm finding is that academics are dispensing ideology to mobilise their ideas about interventions for children and young people, and they're trying to do that by silencing critical female academics. I know that critical voices are mounting, and that that the tide is turning on some of the issues that we're concerned about. And I'm conscious that tonight we can only talk a very little bit about the intensity and the danger of the attempts to suppress our work. But there is cause for optimism. The review of what's happening to Kira Bell coming out next week and so on might give us a point where we can really kind of take confidence again in the power of our work. But I think that mob tactics within the academy have reached such ascendancy that this certainly might not be in time to resist the tyranny that will destroy my own academic career and reputation. I hope there will be accountability. It is appalling to be publicly targeted and harassed, but I think it's so important that we stand by younger critical female academics and we don't trade our silence for our survival. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you for having me speak tonight. And as ever, it's a real pleasure to share a platform with so many brilliant women. So I'm going to begin with some history. And trust me, you're all going to know a lot more about creationism than you expected. It's a subject that's engaged my brain for like 25 years now. And I kind of thought that rational scientific sensibilities had prevailed, but I'm starting to see something very similar rearing its head these days. So in the 1920s, so 100 years ago now, in concert with many other American states, the Tennessee House of Representatives passed something that's now called, or was called at the time even, the Butler Act, which essentially made it illegal for state public schools to teach any theory that denies the kind of biblical account of creationism. So in other words, this act was banning schools from teaching the theory of evolution. And just 3 months later, a Tennessee science teacher, a guy called John Scopes, found himself on trial, charged with teaching the theory of evolution, a crime he was ultimately found guilty of. He was fined $100, that's about $1,500 in today's money. So it could have been quite an expensive affair for him, but he got off on a really boring administrative technicality. So despite the evidence against him, and in fact his own confession, he was actually an innocent man. John Scopes was not guilty of teaching the theory of evolution. He admitted to a crime he had not committed. He even coached his students in their testimonies that they would give in the courtroom against him. He told his students what to say. So why would he admit to this wrongdoing of which he was entirely innocent? Why would he, go to all this effort to contrive his guilt? And the answer is in protest. In protest against a law he viewed as fundamentally incompatible with the pursuit of scientific truth. The history of creationism and education laws in the US is turbulent and often opaquely legalese, especially, for those of us who are unfamiliar with US law. But I think really importantly, some of the methods of the wider creationist movement, those kind of the internet activists, as it was back in those days when I started in this debate, and within the general population, these methods will be for many of you immediately recognisable. As they are employed by what I'm now seeing as a new movement, one which seeks to erase another scientific truth, which is the fact of sex. So some of these methods, method one, the framing of human classifications, whether it's species or sex, as arbitrary. This leads to the premise that such phenomena are social constructs, and that is, they are, I guess, need not exist if we choose to reject them. The idea that truth must be relative and consensual, that we decide what is true. Never mind that these arbitrary classifications appear to be surprisingly similar classifications across all cultures and civilizations. And this kind of tactic necessarily spotlights kind of tricky boundary cases, not really a personal problem for the evolutionary missing links, but a very real problem in the modern world for people whose sex is atypical and who are constantly invoked, and I'd say even fetishized, as not males or not females, to somehow prove sex classification is no more than human whimsy. People with DSDs have complex and often traumatic medical histories, and they struggle sometimes to understand their bodies, and they deserve more respect than to be casually and thoughtlessly used as a postmodernist gotcha by the very people so triggered by a pronoun. Another method, the distortion of science, the development of this sciencey language to create a veneer of academic rigor. Creationists invented concepts like, sorry, I'm laughing all the way through this, it's so ridiculous. Creationists invented concepts like irreducible complexity, specified complexity, all this kind of, how cool does that sound? Sex denialists try to beat people over the head with their dazzling array of bimodal distributions arranged in n-dimensional space. Creationists, unable to publish in mainstream science journals because they weren't producing science, established their own journals. Sex denialists have captured existing journals, albeit limited to the more newsy ones, and as articles to occasional kind of editorials and blogs about gender, which is not sex, about how developmental biology is so complicated, which does not mean sex is complicated. I mean, the internal combustion engine is complicated, but cars still fundamentally go forwards and occasionally backwards. About how discussing the biology of sex is mean. Good luck with that at your GP surgery. And bizarrely, many such blogs and articles are written by scientists who simultaneously deny sex to their social media audience while writing academic papers about how female fruit flies make shells for the eggs. I have no idea what queering the fruit fly is, but I do know that making shells for their eggs is very much a genetic trait and nothing to do with a social construct applied to a small Drosophila. These are scientists who write about the development of ovaries or testes in fish and about how males make sperm. The current editor-in-chief at Nature, who is the first female to hold this position, that's brilliant, studied sex determination in worms for her PhD. And she now presides over a journal with an editorial policy to insert disclaimers about the binary nature of sex into features about research on, for example, different death rates in male and female cystic fibrosis patients. The authors of these studies are not prevaricating or hand-waving about sex, but the editorial team is bending the knee. I used to research a genetic disorder. It's not funny, sorry, I don't know why I'm smiling. A genetic disorder that was male lethal. So what I mean by that is that male human babies died very early in gestation. Only males, not females. And I'd love to know if this disclaimer that sex is not binary would be applied there. Another method, debate strategies, like what we now call the Gish Gallop. This is their favourite. Is named for someone called Dwayne Gish, who is a prominent creationist. And what it boils down to, we've all seen it. Throw any old argument, regardless of its validity, and replete with logical fallacy, in quick succession at your opponent. And then you claim that any dismissal or missed response or even hesitation in response is some kind of point scored for your argument. In Twitter, this is called sea lining. In political propaganda, you know, formal kind of state political propaganda, it's called the fire hose of falsehood. So this kind of unassailable, you know, assault of just a wall of nonsense. And Wikipedia actually does that whole kind of, you may also like, and I swear to you, one of the terms is bullshit. So we see this as a kind of, so what about in-sex people? What about this article? What about an XY person with a uterus? What about the Fafa theme? What about this article? Look at this pretty picture. What about clownfish? The aim is not to discuss or debate. It is to force submission from frustration or exhaustion. Method 4. You know, these similar strategies of creationists and sex denialists, the reification of humans as separate, not just from monkeys, but from the rest of the living world. Special pleading for special descriptions that frame humans as the chosen ones, such that the same process of making new individuals, which is common to humans and asparagus, and let's be clear, I chose asparagus because it seems so superficially silly. I could have chosen spinach. This process in humans requires its own description, and as we're seeing, one that accounts for gender identity, which is never applied to this basic biological process in any other species. Okay, so in the Scopes trial, this Tennessee trial where this science teacher kind of took an expensive or potentially expensive, but definitely perjurious fall in the name of scientific truth, you know, they were discussing whether Eve was actually created from Adam's rib, and where Cain got his wife. Scopes was defended by a legal group who had begun scouting for a test case subject as soon as the Tennessee ban on teaching evolution was enacted. This legal group, it sounds brilliant, they claim to advocate for, and this is a quote, freedom of speech for ideas from the most extreme left, such as anarchists and socialists, to the most extreme right, including the Ku Klux Klan, Henry Ford, and others who would now be considered more towards the fascist end of the spectrum. It's probably obvious. The legal group so keen to defend the right to speak the truth, in this case of fundamental, observable scientific truth, the American Civil Liberties Union, a group whose modern day social media presence promotes nonsense like, quotes, the notion of biological sex was developed for the exclusive purpose of being weaponized against people. And sex and gender are different words for the same thing. That is a set of politically and socially contingent notions of embodied and expressed identity. And they're sharing articles asserting that biological sex is a product of white supremacy and so on. Since the Scopes case, so back in the 1920s, since that case, the ACLU has fought against many US laws preventing, or at the very least compromising, the teaching of evolution. I can't really process the irony of a group of people historically and consistently prepared to robustly defend the truth of evolution while now denying one of the most important biological foundations of evolution. How do we fight this? How do we fight this current craze of sex denialism? So a major blow for creationism teaching came in 1986. And that was a time when the US Supreme Court were considering a Louisiana state law that required creationism to be taught alongside evolution to provide balance. The Louisiana law was struck down by the Supreme Court, in part influenced by the expert opinions submitted to the court of scientists who put aside their individual, and it's amazing, who put aside all their individual differences on theory X and experiment Y. And one of the scientists actually said these these differences were often violent. So, I mean, science conferences aren't usually that fun, but I guess they were having fun back then. So all these scientists got together and put aside all their individual scientific disagreements to present a unified defense of scientific truth over religious belief. And they were 76 Nobel laureates, 17 state academies of science, and a good handful of scientific organizations all got behind this single cause. And they made a very real change since that 1986. So actually it was in 1987 when the judgment came through. And you know, this law was struck down that you needed to teach creationism even just as balance against evolution. Support for creationism has slowly ebbed away, and the US is thankfully in a much more sensible position these days, although I still meet the occasional student from a very stereotyped southern state who didn't learn about evolution until college. Sadly, one of the Nobel laureates that was involved in that 1986 expert opinion highlighted how unusual this collective response was. Presumably because they're all too busy punching each other after a conference dinner, and that he couldn't really imagine any other issue that would receive the same kind of groundswell of community support. But he was a physicist. He forged his career very excellently, listening for the Big Bang. So I promised myself this afternoon when I read about this that I need to go through that list and find some biologists. But part of the problem of petitioning biologists to speak out about the reality of sex is not actually necessarily, I think, fear of being cancelled or, you know, that kind of social media backlash, but really just a lack of awareness. And Kathleen alluded to this earlier. It hasn't really hit the biological sciences or the medical sciences quite so obviously. So lack of awareness, or just, you know, when I talk about it over a beer, just incredulity that this is a remotely serious kind of proposition. I've been working on a legal document about sports, and I was chatting with a colleague about my efforts to find a citation. I didn't realise I'd need one, but I did apparently. My efforts to find a citation for the statement, "There are two sexes, male and female." And he laughed. He's a developmental biologist like me. He laughed at the idea that this would require a citation. And then he just kind of said, well, check a textbook. Oh, textbooks won't say it, will they? It's, you know, it's too simple a statement that it wouldn't even be included in a textbook. And he's right. I can find whole chapters in textbooks and hundreds of academic papers dedicated to how males and females are made, how they develop, how they differ. Yet very few that feel the need to preface any of this with the statement, there are two sexes, male and female. It is apparently something that biologists do not think needs to be said. But of course, I think they are wrong, and that we live in a time where it does need to be said, where some aspects of society are being restructured around a scientific untruth, and where females will suffer. Without recognition of and language to describe our anatomy and the experiences that stem from that anatomy, mostly uninvited experiences, we can neither detect nor measure things like the rates of violence against women or our medical and social experiences. We won't even be able to accurately tell how many of us are being born. And as for creationism, 40 years ago now, the reality of sex perhaps needs to be said by those with scientific authority in unambiguous terms. Otherwise, we're living in a society that tolerates nonsense like there's no such thing as male or female, that differences evident to our own eyes are not real, that anatomies readily observable and existing in monkey and man alike do not actually exist. And I'm pretty sure that that last assertion will appeal very much to the creationist community. And I think perhaps, as it was for creationism, a true tipping point will be tested when the reality that perhaps our children are being taught these scientific untruths, or worse, when it's illegal to say something different. At the end of his trial, the only words that John Scopes uttered in court were these, and this is a quote: "Your Honour, I feel that I've been convicted." Remember, it was a false conviction. He took a fall. "I feel that I've been convicted of violating an unjust statute. I will continue in the future, as I have in the past, to oppose this law in any way I can. Any other action would be in violation of my ideal of academic freedom. That is, to teach the truth as guaranteed in our Constitution of personal and religious freedom." I do not exaggerate when I say that we're dealing with a new type of religion, a new form of creationism, and a new assault on scientific truth. I also don't exaggerate when I say it may take a high-profile court case to rebalance the public discourse around sex. Not me or other women at the University of Manchester who have been hauled into our equality department or dragged through grievance processes for the crime of saying sex is real, or for supporting feminist groups like Women's Place UK. And there is only so far that letters and opinion articles in mainstream media or even in scientific journals can go. Two things I predict. One, such a court case will not be defended by the ACLU. And secondly, with recent proposals on hate speech law, it will probably involve a Scottish John Scopes, someone who finds themselves in front of a judge for the seditious crime of discussing the sex life of asparagus at their dinner table. I'll finish there. Thank you.
So I would like to respectfully disagree with Kathleen. I think that the ideas of queer theory and Judith Butler have escaped from the academy and gone into the mainstream. And it's because of this that we can understand exactly what Michelle was talking about and exactly what Emma was talking about. So I'm going to use as an example the fact that queer theory, whether people recognize it or not, is absolutely embedded in the problems that we've been talking about, and is a foundation for them. And I'm going to use an example. So on November the 20th, the Transgender Remembrance Day, Angela Rayner, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, conveyed either knowingly or unknowingly several unsubstantiated opinions, even untruths. Firstly, she asserted that trans people have a true self and should be loved and be accepted for who they really are. Secondly, she implied that trans people are routinely tragically killed in this country, when in fact no trans person has been murdered in the UK this year. Thirdly, she stated the non-existent murders happened because of prejudice, bigotry, and a climate of hatred of trans people and who they really are. And lastly, she backed this up with hate crime statistics, that hate crime has quadrupled in the past 4 years. So what has that got to do with today's topic? In liberal democracies, the university has a very particular role to play in relation to truth. One of its roles is to provide a forum in which a range of ideas can be openly debated and evidence critically scrutinized. As an academic researcher on sex, gender, and medicine, I can demonstrate, and have done in the books that I've written and the articles I've written, that Rayner's assertions presented as truth are wholly ideological. I also assert that it is not the function of politicians to convey ideology as fact, to present their own values as beyond debate, and I insist it's dangerous to do so, and that the casualties are women and children's rights, and indeed liberal democracy itself. So my my research, my truth claims and my evidence may be completely wrong. It's up to others to engage with my ideas in dialogue, to ask me to demonstrate why I'm wrong, and to present alternative evidence, which can also be openly scrutinized. But something very serious has been happening within the university, where these established conventions of debate and dialogue and evidence production are breaking down. As someone who's gender critical, I've written elsewhere about how queer theory underpins the trans ideology, which Raina was actually spouting, whether she has ever in her life read a queer theory text. That queer theory has taken hold in the academy as the dominant theoretical explanation about sex, gender, social discrimination, and social injustice. And this has intersected with a powerful trans lobby, influential at the heart of government and social policy, whether or not politicians and policymakers have even heard of queer theory or Judith Butler. And consequently, a mob mentality has been allowed to thrive in the university, where queer-informed academics and students robustly attempt and sometimes succeed in gagging any alternative view, however mild, that transgender theory and politics can harm, sometimes even inadvertently, women and children. In fact, there has been a call for no debate. So those conventions, those academic conventions, have actually are being severely undermined in humanities departments. So many female academics nationally, as well as the ones present here, have had talks cancelled, jobs threatened, books banned, journal articles refused, research grants made unavailable to them. So a talk back is very much needed, and I highlight here 2 areas where talk back is essential. And that the first is what I call the trans ministry of truth, or the queer ministry of truth, we could equally call it that. Reverses reality. Sex is culturally assigned at birth, apparently, so that being a boy or a girl is socially constructed, not a biological fact. In contrast, gender identity is inborn, even though the baby has not as yet been exposed to any such stereotyping. Women can have penises, men can get pregnant. Of course, I believe that anyone in liberal democracy has the human right to identify as they wish. Thank goodness. But trans ideology, that men can be women and have rights to enter spaces designated for women, and that these rights should supersede women's rights to safety, is clearly a breach and erasure of women and children's human rights. The consequences for women and children, from sport to prisons to women's refuges to what children can be taught in schools, have been clearly, feminists have written and talked about this, thank goodness, and they've done so vociferously. But these truths have been taken from the Ministry of Truth and have invaded our institutions. The second talk back needed is concerned with the medicalization of children, on the basis, using Rayner's terms, that trans people are truly trans. So the Gender Development Identity Services at the Tavistock is founded on queer theory, not science. WPATH, that's the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, on whose guidelines the service depends, is also a pseudoscientific organization based on queer theory. I have researched, evidenced, and documented this in my writing on many, many occasions. The adherence to unproven theory, the lack of analysis of the structural social issues causing the exponential rise in girls declaring that they're boys, the service's policy of gender identity in affirmation, directly from queer theory, and the inability of the child to give informed consent because of her psychological immaturity, and the consequences of cross-sex hormones resulting in sterility, is nothing less, in my view, than child abuse, enacted in plain sight. I await the results of the judicial review of the service coming this Tuesday to hear whether the judges agree with me that this practice of medicalizing children must stop. I will talk back, and I will continue to talk back about this phenomenon. But my point here is that the abuse of women and children's rights might never have occurred if proper discussion and analysis had not been suppressed within the academy. The connection between theory, political parties, lobby groups such as Stonewall, children's charities such as Gendered Intelligence and Mermaids, and organizations tasked with upholding equality, such as the Equality and Human Rights Commission or the Crown Prosecution Service, should be open for analysis. If all was well in our body politic, these institutions would welcome scrutiny. They have not. So to return to Rayner, figures released last week from a study entitled The Femicide Census show that between 2000 and 2018, some 1,425 female victims were killed by men in Britain. On average, a woman was murdered every 3 days, a horrifying statistic, unchanged over the decade. By comparison, a charity named Trans Respect versus Transphobia Worldwide reported that in the last 12 years, 11 trans people were murdered in the UK. As deputy leader, Rayner made no equivalent emotional appeal to the social injustice of violence against women. And by default, gender feminists, it is implied, are to blame for the murder against the murder of men who identify as women, since no data are preferred as to who is doing the murdering, i.e., it's men. This hate crime statistics she quotes are highly unstable. I myself have been reported to West Yorkshire Police for committing a hate crime by saying I disagree that children are truly trans, rather than children actually have gender dysphoria. The College of Policing's definition of hate includes the perception of the victim, which is the defining factor in determining whether an incident has occurred. The perception of hate often arises from statements of biological truth, such as female is a biological reality, woman, noun, adult, human, female, or sex is biological, dimorphic, and immutable. Rayner presented hate crime statistics as absolute fact. So, Rayner signed a Labour Party document where she pledged to accept that trans women are women, that there is no material conflict between trans rights and women's rights, that she would help organise and fight against the WPUK and LGB Alliance, and she would as hate groups, and she would support the expulsion from the Labour Party of those who disagree. So I have argued that all of this, the relationship between what's happening in the university, that any disagreement with trans ideology is suppressed, is treated as hateful. It just gets connected up with our institutions, are fundamentally based on the popularity of queer theory and its amazing rise from an arcane theory, which hardly anybody can read, to allegedly simple truth. In conclusion, the advances women scholars and their contribution to public debate and the democratic process are being incrementally dismantled. And the casualty is truth, is women and children, and more than that, the casualty is liberal democracy itself. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Dr. Megan Tyler. I'm based at RMIT University in Melbourne in Australia. And, you know, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here, and a huge thanks especially to Raquel for organising. I'm normally the organiser a lot of the time, so I feel like I feel her pain with all of the hard effort that goes behind getting something like this together. As I said, I'm coming to you from Melbourne. It's still pretty early hours of the morning here. I got up at 3:30 this morning to do our sound check. So forgive me for relying on my notes a bit as I speak to you today. I don't want to lose track, which I might well do at this time of the morning. You can probably see too behind me, I'm coming to you from my makeshift study, probably pretty much like everyone else, which is where I've been stuck for the last 8 months since they closed our university campus. We haven't been allowed back all the way, back since March. And we're emerging from more than 100 days of lockdown here in this city. So for those of you in the midst of your own pandemic waves, wherever you might be in the world, sending some solidarity. It's been a hell of a year. Also, because I'm coming to you from Melbourne, I would like to take a moment to pay my respects to the Woiwurrung and Bunurong language groups of the mighty Kulin nations as the traditional custodians of the land that I live and work on here. It's stolen land that was never ceded, and a treaty has never been signed. And so what a topic we are here to be discussing. You know, I think what great lineup of speakers, and I'm recognising quite a few names in the chat as well, which is fabulous. And, you know, it's certainly just as pertinent to be talking about these issues of feminism and academic freedom on my side of the globe as it is in the UK. And I'm really glad that we're talking about this during the United Nations 16 Days of Activism to End Violence Against Women, because that's my area of expertise, really. That's what I've spent most of my career researching and writing about. Started my PhD about 15 years ago, and I've been an academic for 10 years. So I'm sort of at that liminal space in between early career academic and the dreaded mid-career kind of thing. And if any of you have read my work, you probably already know most of it is focused on the sex trade and violence, particularly pornography, but also prostitution and trafficking, which means you get treated quite differently from researchers who say just focus on something like domestic violence. And I'm going to focus a little bit on my own personal experiences here, which I think will also show you that the patterns you've heard about from the other speakers do predate debates about gender identity, these problems in the academy. And if you follow me on Twitter, like I say, I recognise some of the names already, which is great. My pinned tweet is actually a thread about what it's like to be a female academic critiquing the sex industry. It's an area of study I don't really feel like I ever consciously chose. And I've since discovered it's not the kind of thing that you plot out a stellar academic career around. But I didn't know that when I started out. I was sort of fueled, I guess, by a mixture of anger about what I saw happening around me during the rise of pornification in the early 2000s, and inspiration from having had the benefit of exposure to radical feminism in my university studies as an undergraduate, as well as a belief in academic study as a path to create a meaningful contribution to feminism. As a working class kid and the first in my family to go to university, I also felt like education had opened pathways to me that I'd never dreamed of. I know that sounds really trite, but it's true. And in taking a political science degree, I was lucky enough to be taught by people who transitioned from various forms of really quite radical activism into new careers in the academy. And I kind of thought, oh, that'd be cool. I'd like to do that. I was also lucky enough to catch the last remnants of what higher education meant in Australia before neoliberalism. And that's what I'm going to also talk a little bit about today. I think it's something we haven't really talked about much here, but it's very important, I think, to understand the background of the sort of situation we've ended up in. Although free higher education was abolished about a decade before I got to uni, the attitude of a lot of the faculty was fortunately pretty much of the previous era. There was a really clear commitment to learning and challenging the status quo without fear or favour. People openly and passionately disagreed, and that was presented to us as students as perfectly normal. And I mention all of that as background because, to me, you just can't fully understand the quashing of feminist thought and debate in universities without understanding these effects of neoliberalism and the corporatisation of the academy. There's been a slow but pretty palpable sense of suffocation among critical academics in a range of fields in Australia. A real fear of speaking out, probably one that's worse if, like me, through a bizarre twist of fate, you happen to end up being a radical feminist in a business school. So while I think feminists have copped it worse, we're not alone. And in some ways, I think we can just be seen as like the canaries down the mine in terms of the strangling of academic freedom and the stifling of varied branches of critical thought in higher education. But what does this really look like on the ground? I mean, you've heard a little bit about that already, but what does it mean for those of us who believe that a structural analysis of women's oppression and men's violence against us is not only vital, but should belong in universities as well as outside of them? And I just want to give you kind of, again, a few personal examples. I mean, there's the small things that kind of just, the drip, drip, drip effect that makes you feel unwelcome. Things like being told you're a very risky appointment because you talk too much about violence against women, or your dean complaining to your line manager about your online profile being too depressing. That's probably one of my favourites because, again, it focused too much on violence against women, despite the fact that obviously that's my main research area. But then you've also got like the structural issues of the marginalisation of feminist analysis, especially radical feminism, materialist and socialist feminist analyses across so much of the social sciences and humanities, including in gender studies, which you've already heard about. I mean, kind of ironic you'd expect to hopefully find great feminist analyses there. But alas, you've also got issues around feminist journals or journals focused on violence against women, really reaching the kind of top tier of publishing metrics in places like Australia. A little bit different, though, if you're prepared to write about masculinity, which, again, is interesting in and of itself. But these, along with neoliberalisation and corporatisation, as I said, are the backdrop to what happens when you more acutely and overtly, or possibly even accidentally, in my case, challenge your own university's branding, when you cross this invisible line that's been drawn somewhere without you even knowing it. And I thought before I go on to a specific example, I'd also say I'm pretty used to attacks from others. I think unlike maybe some of the other speakers you've heard who had long careers before finding themselves in controversial water, that was pretty much how I started. I think you develop a pretty thick skin doing this kind of work for a whole variety of reasons, as you can probably imagine. But I didn't realise how different work was for those not writing feminist analyses of violence against women in the sex industry for a long time. I was an academic literally for years and years before I realised that not all of my colleagues expect to get hostility and abuse when they give conference papers, for example. I just thought that was normal. Most of them, it turns out, kind of expect polite applause and maybe a bit of disappointment at dull comments being asked in the Q&A. But someone being a total asshole was just sort of my reality of the academy. A pro-porn professor or a pro-sex work activist throwing around swerf and sort of suggesting that really my research was the real problem that we needed to be addressing here, that was victimising women rather than the actual men doing the actual violating of actual women. And public speaking outside of academic events, that often comes with the same kind of tactics that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Claims that my work and therefore my presence at an event makes other people unsafe, that I should therefore not be given a platform by any progressive organisation, as though feminism is not progressive, and even the occasional outlandish accusation like that I'm part of a radical feminist gang that breaks into homes of sex workers in order to dox them. I'm not making that one up, as you can probably guess. It's very specific. An anonymous group put together a public statement suggesting that, claiming that that's what I was doing a couple of years back to try and get me no platformed. But during all these kinds of, impingement, from sort of unpleasantness at one end to outright threats at the other, my institution, or different institutions, in fact, over time had stood by me. And what I wasn't so well prepared for was when certain people at a new university seemed to feel my activities weren't quite on brand enough. And I'm just going to give you a bit of detail about one incident in particular. And I think that's important because I think we need to understand how the functions of the corporate university are such a threat to feminism. And I think maybe if you're outside the academy, sometimes what happens behind the curtain is a bit of a mystery. So despite my institution being an award-winning employer of choice for gender equality, as they like to keep wheeling out, and the kind of place that hands out a lot of paraphernalia about respect at work, there isn't much room for the kind of feminist analysis that anyone might ever get upset about, or much assertion of the need for students or other staff to respect me and the women that I work with. So I run a feminist forum seminar series with two colleagues, Dr. Kay Queck and Dr. Kate File. I'm just going to put a link in the chat for you to the Feminist Forum website. Kay and Kate are both fabulous scholars, work on marriage trafficking in the case of Kay, and popular conceptions of lesbian sexuality, and also violence against women in rural and regional areas is something that Kate has moved into. And we were all actually PhD students of Sheila Jeffries at Melbourne Uni. So when she retired, we moved the seminars she'd been running down the road for about 20 years or so to another uni, where we had all managed to land jobs, which was kind of a minor miracle in itself. 3 radical feminists working at the same institution is quite something. And it went fine for a while. We had seminars about how Amnesty International had really lost its way by letting a pimp determine their policy approach to the sex trade. We had seminars about football culture and rape. We had seminars about the need to abolish marriage. That was one of my favourites. But then we had a seminar on the intersections of violence against women in the sex industry and surrogacy with Renata Klein and Julie Bindel, and all hell broke loose. So the university pulled the room we had booked less than 48 hours before the event was scheduled to go ahead. And the chief operations officer said they didn't know about the event, as though we were supposed to personally notify her of all of our academic seminars, and that they feared there might be protests that could potentially disrupt nearby classes. And on that basis, it couldn't go ahead. She did apologise for the inconvenience, but she didn't seem to think there was anything particularly problematic about shutting down an academic event featuring 2 prominent lesbian feminists speaking about violence against women. Of course, we kicked back. We faced down the COO and the Deputy Vice-Chancellor and the Head of Risk, and eventually they agreed to pay for an off-campus venue and security. But it was really unpleasant. Women had to kind of file themselves through a lot of heavy security, and our options for the new venue were either A, a nearby church, or B, a function centre that turned out to be a few doors down from a brothel. So nothing really could have better solidified in my mind exactly why we needed to be able to have access to our campus and run feminist events there, just as we are entitled to do. The aftermath also of that, I would say, confirmed our worst fears about university management and bureaucracy in a lot of ways. I was called to a meeting with about 15 senior executives, from the head of communications and the head of HR to several members of the diversity and inclusion team. Fortunately, I was able to drag along the head of my research centre, a very sympathetic professor, for backup. And in a room of about 20 people, we were only 2 academics. The meeting began with one of the executives offering up the personal reflection that she had acted as a surrogate herself so she could see why the seminar was offensive, and she thought that was relevant information. It wasn't until about halfway through the meeting that one of the other executives interrupted to actually ask what academic freedom was. And then they all kind of suddenly turned to the 2 of us, and we were more than just cardboard cutouts. But it was shocking to me in that moment to see that this foundational idea on which the whole of university life and knowledge production is based meant literally nothing to a room of people who had flocked to higher education to escape the corporate worlds of banking, for-profit private healthcare and telecommunications. So, it's not a surprise on some level, I suppose, that feminism is very threatening to them, not to you, obviously. So feminism is very threatening to them. Academic freedom is also threatening to them. And feminists exercising their academic freedom is especially threatening to them. In fact, as an aside, we held another Feminist Forum event specifically on no platforming as a feminist issue with Dr. Holly Lawford-Smith, who I'm sure some of you will know. And I was pretty convinced that no one would be stupid enough to try and no platform a feminist speaking about no platforming as a feminist issue. But I was wrong, and we basically had to go through that whole thing again. So you can see how it has a pretty chilling effect on academic freedom and the ability of feminist academics to just even do their job, let alone speak out. So I'm also aware that's pretty bleak, as both I think Kathleen and Michelle noted. So I also think it's kind of an obvious question, I suppose, of why don't we all leave the academy and run as far away as possible? And, you know, maybe we should. Some of us have. There are alternative online feminist studies. There's feminist summer schools. In fact, we run a very low-cost feminist summer school ourselves. And, you know, there are even sort of feminist think tanks developing in some places. And absolutely, universities do not have a monopoly on knowledge or education. But I think there are also really good reasons to stay and fight. Our challenges here as feminists are also inextricably caught up with the fight for free higher education and the decorporatisation of the higher education sector. I think we should fight for the right to have interwoven feminist activism and academic work. We should be able to pool our resources and build from universities to educate new generations of young women. There should be a foundational place for feminism and a structural analysis of power and men's violence in a whole variety of degrees. I do not think we should give that up. I also want to note, I think it's Fiona McDonald in the chat has been mentioning trade unions quite a bit, and maybe that's something we can talk about in the Q&A, because I think there is a possible role of that as well. I'm the academic vice president of my union branch, for example. I think there are still some potential opportunities to fight back through those avenues. But also perhaps we need like kind of a new kind of collective, something like Feminists for Academic Freedom, although I'm aware that acronym is then sort of FAF, which is probably not the greatest. Maybe we can work on that. But in all seriousness, I think it's really vital that we don't just fall back on these libertarian ideas about free speech or the need for all perspectives to be heard. To pick up on Emma's presentation, I don't think we should be just arguing that it's fair and reasonable to teach creationism for balance. But instead, I think we need to reclaim and reassert the immense value of feminist knowledge, feminist research, feminist teaching, and feminist activism, and how important all of this is to the ongoing struggle against men's violence and for women's liberation. That's it from me. Thanks.
Well, I'm very glad that all the speakers were able to deliver their speeches, and there's been a lively chat going on in the Q&A section. So I wonder if we only have time for a couple of questions that the audience has sent in. The first one is, how can people support feminist academics, both students and staff members, who are experiencing this targeting within universities? Any suggestions for people, not only people who are in academia, but like how can we make the climate better?
Shall I have? I've got some vague thoughts there. I mean, I think if you're at a university as a student or a staff member, and and you're sympathetic, and I'm assuming if you're watching this, you are, and you know that there's somebody there who is speaking out, I think you should contact them and express your support and ask them what you can do, because part of the, I don't want to speak for everyone, but in my experience, part of the problem is isolation. Mentally, you might be well supported across the country or whatever, but in your own institution, you're a complete pariah. And so that's one thing you can do. And also, I mean, then you can start to build up networks with sympathetic people at your university, and then you can present cases jointly, as it seems like to me like Megan's already doing brilliantly, and I'm really envious of her for having so many fabulous feminist colleagues in Melbourne. So that's one thought I had.
I would back it up also and say, can you write to the heads of our departments and say that you really appreciate the balance of education that you're being given in an institute that you're paying for?
Yeah, because all they ever hear is bad news about us, really.
Megan, do you have something to contribute too? Okay. If Michelle or Heather, do you have something to contribute to?
I have my mic on, but the camera won't come back. But yeah, as well as writing to our vice chancellors, it's also important, I think, that you start working with your union, because union members who want to support us are becoming quite isolated in their endeavour. And I think there's quite a lot of work, particularly in the UK, to do around making sure that union members are able to support critical female academics in ways which we need supporting.
But Michelle, can you hear me?
Yeah.
How do you think, what's the best way to kind of enact that? Because I'm pretty sure that the UCU policy, which is the university's union, are, you know, what practical measures, other than writing, you know, the same old letters that we write to every institution, what? I don't know, it just feels like it's a bit kind of a fire hose of falsehood at the moment.
Yeah, I think it is going to have to be a question of just having the conversations with individuals at the moment and trying to do what Megan's done, which is kind of find one to join one and build up pockets of people who feel strong enough. But at my university, we have a whole branch who are mobilising to, against critical academics. So it really is a very important thing to start these conversations. And we also have the problem of people who are union representatives in that context, but wanting to support critical female academics, standing down from the union because they feel that they can't support you safely. So I think, yeah, there is a lot of work to do, and we can't be complacent about that. But yeah, every conversation, I think, makes a difference. And very often when you have these conversations, even though you're terrified to start them, somebody will say, oh yeah, I secretly think that too. And the mobilisation of change is off. But yeah, I think it's really important. My own experience of finding a whole branch working against me has been quite harrowing.
Yeah, but we also need more than, I mean, it's always great when someone says to you secretly, I do support you, but really we do need more than that at this stage.
Yes, yeah.
People are professors, and they have written into the statutes of their universities that it is part of the university's mission to test controversial opinion. Then if you're being paid like 50 grand a year, you should, and you feel strongly about this, you should be saying something, because you are protected by universities. Academics have this unique role in civil society of being able to say what other people cannot say for fear of losing their jobs. And the fact that academics are not stepping up and saying what they think, I mean, I can understand why that's happening, but you really need to start showing some backbone, is my view.
Heather, is there something that you would like to contribute as well?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
I think the fact that this ideology of sex being socially constructed and gender identity as being innate has become so powerful that people are afraid of talking back. And you know, the thing about fear is that it captures, it in a sense there's nothing to fear so much as fear itself. If we talk back and keep talking back and then keep talking back again, and we all did it, and I know it's difficult, but if we did and we joined hands together in doing that, we would be unassailable, because truth is on our side, scientific evidence is on our side, our social statistics are on our side, and so on. So we need to stand strong and speak out.
Can I just put in there? I wonder if, just to kind of go back to the theme of all the talks as well, that And Kathleen, you started with the idea that biology and medicine isn't really challenged by this idea. I mean, we see it occasionally, but we're not really dealing with it. Do biology and medic people have to kind of really come through here and like not lead a charge, but you know what I mean? Do we have to? We're not just fighting generally, we're fighting for our own colleagues.
Yeah, I think everybody needs to say something. I mean, they can't be unaware by now of something.
I think they are. I genuinely think they are.
Well, I mean, it's a long battle ahead. It really is.
Okay, so the second, and I think this could be our final question, is how representative, we're talking about women feminist researchers within academia, but how representative is this, both of your colleagues, academics colleagues, and also the student body? The ideas of, sex is mutable, and what is a woman? How representative?
So it's completely. I mean, this is not even remotely acknowledged. I can teach freely talking about women and men and males and females and sex is this and sex is that. So mine is very easy. It goes back again to what Kathleen said. We're kind of untouched unless you seek it out. So okay. So I'm okay with that. Apart from the people who report me to university for talking about that, but
my experience is that in all these culture wars, it's a small number of ideologues that are dominating the conversation and chilling it, and that if you actually talk to people most of the time, they don't have extreme views, and they do acknowledge the reality of sex as a kind of banal truism. So, and I'm teaching feminist philosophy this term, and I've been talking all the way through about women and girls, and at the end I'm going to be talking about sex and gender, where we will air various theories, and I will allow students to draw their own conclusions without having to push them in a particular direction, although obviously I will make my own views clear. But I find students respond fine to that approach, and they really haven't changed as much in the 15 years I've been teaching them. Most of them are still questioning, open-minded, idealistic, but respectful. So I think that we see a caricature quite often based on social media appearances of a few highly ideological, intolerant students and academics. I mean, this ramifies out to every section of society. The whole thing is being paralyzed by just a few voices, and everyone else is too frightened to speak. So I think that's in our favour if we could really get that message home, because I don't think the new generation is somehow irredeemably corrupted by queer theory. I just don't recognise that at all. I just think something else is going on. And the more we speak up about it, the more easy it will become for everyone else to speak.
Heather, Michelle, or Megan, or Emma, is there something that you would like to add?
I'd just like to endorse what Kathleen was saying. The more we speak, the better. But I do see in my institution that it's not easy for people to speak, and there can be very material and very quick, swift consequences for having spoken. So it's the business of speaking together, and solidarity between us, I think, is really important. Mm-hmm. Sorry, Heather, I think I interrupted you.
That's okay. Yes, I agree with both you and Kathleen. I think that the more we speak out, the more people will also be able to say, we don't agree with it, we don't really believe in it, but we were sort of too frightened. We thought that we couldn't say that. And so we need people to be able to, we need to give confidence to other people so that they can say, we don't really believe that.
Okay, I was just wondering if we could discuss for a couple of seconds any coping mechanisms that you have found useful, because we have hundreds of women in the chat who are reading, who are watching you. So what has been something helpful for you to get by?
I could say one. I realized pretty early on because I had this real fear starting that there was going to be an argument out there that I hadn't thought of, or there's some really sophisticated way in which it could be true that you could change sex, or that women weren't really a proper category. And then the more I got into it, the more I realised that pretty much every single objection I met online, or insult hurled at me, or attempt to petition against me, was an attempt to make me feel ashamed. And really, that is what they are trying to do. They want you to feel shame, embarrassment, and to be quiet. And as long as you stop feeling beautiful, but just don't feel shame. You have no reason to feel shame. They should be ashamed of the way they're behaving. So really just try and cling on to your self-belief that way, and see what it is, see what these insults and criticisms and undermining of your confidence are, what they are. That's my coping mechanism.
Yeah. Emma, Megan, Heather, or Michelle, is there something you'd like to contribute?
Well, I liked hearing that from Kathleen, because I'm right in the middle of it at the moment, and the thing that really knocks me back is that fear of humiliation, fear of public shaming, all that kind of thing. Those are very difficult things to fight your way through. So yeah, that's a really important message, I think, to all of us, to try and hang on to our self-esteem and not let those feelings get the better of us. But we've got a hard road to go, and the sisterhood and the community that we can offer each other is really, really helpful. And I am really so grateful to so many women of this community who've stood by me.
I'd just like to add to that what actually goes on, this sort of psychological mechanisms, as it were, is the group mentality of the mob. So that, if you're ganged up against what you feel, you take the feelings internally and question yourself. And what you do is you get smaller and smaller, and your instinct is to walk away because it's just too painful. But actually, what you need to do is, as Kathleen says, is to work out, don't take on the shame. And there aren't actually any really complex arguments out there that you haven't thought of. It's actually us that have the complex arguments. We've thought it through. So, my strategy is then just don't allow myself to be bullied. And once you get that mental attitude, it's really strange how effective it actually is, and you almost become immune to what anybody says to you. Of course, that's dependent on you having a few fellow travellers to link arm in arm with, as it were.
Yeah.
Megan, do you have something you'd like to say?
Can you actually hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I've been trying to talk pretty much for the last 10 minutes, but never mind. I would mostly probably echo what all the other women have said here anyway, right? We need to form bonds of solidarity. And I guess one of the other things maybe that I would add is not, falling into the trap of thinking your enemy's enemy is your friend. And I think sometimes I've seen even some things in the chat of these people could be allies even though we disagree with them. And I don't think that is actually useful for us as feminist academics, or as feminists who want to support academic freedom for feminist writing and research. I think, kind of getting in a way to what Heather was saying, that we need to be able to stand on our own 2 feet and say what we are doing is important. It doesn't have to be under the frame of freedom of speech, which I think is something that often gets run back to. I think academic freedom is actually a much more important concept that relies on, again, this sense of truth and expertise, that rather than just saying everyone deserves a crack at saying whatever they like, there's more to that here. And I think we need to be able to be asserting that, it's not, I don't know, that every if you accept us, you also have to accept all the wacko opinions out there. I think we've almost felt backed into a corner to that's the point that the argument gets to, rather than asserting the right of us as feminists to put forward these arguments, and that feminism and a radical materialist feminism is actually important and is worthy knowledge to be out in the public sphere.
Yes, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for participating. I think that we have run out of time. Again, I would like to apologize for the technical issues. We're trying our best here, but thank you to our speakers, Dr. Kathleen Stock, Dr. Emma Hilton, Dr. Megan Tyler, Dr. Heather Brunskill-Evans, and Dr. Michelle Moore. Thank you very much to Philia Charity for letting us use their platform so that we can host hundreds of women tonight here. And thank you to all of our attendees for registering tonight. So have a good evening, everyone.
Thanks, bye.
Or a good morning in my case. So yeah.
Bye.